Lord, we thank you for bringing us here together this evening on this feast of St. Patrick. We also turn to St. Patrick to ask his blessing and the Lord's blessing on our speaker, Margarita Mooney Suarez. May the Lord grant her words to enlighten and inspire us as she speaks to us of suffering, solidarity, and resilience. Especially now, Lord, as our hearts are somewhat weighed down by the sufferings of our brothers and sisters in Ukraine who are suffering from the ravages of war. We ask you to enlighten us so that we will be able to help them not only with our prayers, but also with anything we can do to help them and show solidarity for them in their own suffering. We also ask you through this conference to help us to see suffering in our own lives, in the lives of those around us, with that supernatural spirit of faith, that it is a pathway to wholeness and holiness. And we place all of these intentions in through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mater Dolorosa, who was there at the foot of the cross with her son Jesus. And we ask all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
My name is Dr. Stephen Grunman. I'm the Professor of Integrative Studies in our Doctorate in Psychology program. I'll be your MC for tonight, both introducing our speaker and facilitating the question and answer session afterwards. Let me first welcome you to the Newman Lecture Series. The Newman Lecture Series features speakers who are widely recognized for their contributions to the fields of psychology, moral and political philosophy, theology, and law. This lecture series is held under the sponsorship of Divine Mercy University and seeks to promote an international conversation among various disciplines that treat the human person. Each lecture series is published with an eye toward building a body of learned discussion that is Catholic, both in its breadth of research and in its dialogue with contemporary Catholic Christian thought. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Margarita Mooney Suarez, is Associate Professor of Congregational Studies in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. She earned her MA and PhD in Sociology from Princeton University and her BA in Psychology at Yale University. She has also been on the faculty of Yale University, Princeton University, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Pepperdine University. At Princeton Theological Seminary, she teaches classes on philosophy of social science, Christianity and the liberal arts tradition, aesthetics, research methods for congregational leaders, intentional communities, and sociology of religion. Her research has received approximately $3 million in funding from the John Templeton Foundation. Dr. Mooney Suarez's most recent book, The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts, Clooney Media 2021, grew out of her decades of experience as a teacher and scholar. Her book, Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora, demonstrated how religious communities support the successful adaptation of Haitian immigrants in the US, Canada, and France. In addition to her scholarly books and articles, Dr. Mooney Suarez has written for publications that reach wide audiences, both inside and outside academia, such as Real Clear Policy, Scientific American, The Chronicle of Higher Education, the Miami Herald, Plow Magazine, America Magazine, First Things, Hedgehog Review, Public Discourse, Church Life Journal, and the National Catholic Register. In 2016, Dr. Mooney Suarez founded Scala Foundation, which seeks to infuse meaning and purpose into American education by restoring a classical liberal arts education. Her lecture tonight is entitled Suffering, Solidarity, and Resilience, Sacred and Everyday Liturgies and the Search for Happiness. Please join me in offering a hearty welcome to Dr. Margarita Mooney Suarez. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight at Divine Mercy University. And the insights that I'm going to share with you through my intellectual journey, beginning in psychology, moving into sociology, and now into a field called practical theology, I want to share with you some of my own interviews with young adults who have suffered trauma, as well as some of the reflections I have from studying American religious history, as well as early Christian history, about the importance of rituals and reenacting dramas around experiences of suffering. I think these topics are extremely important right now because we're in a culture that's desperately in need of forgiveness and mercy and compassion. And I think that the examples I'm going to share with you tonight, I hope, will help people of faith understand a little bit about what's happening in our culture and think about what it might look like to help people come home to the Father, like the prodigal son, knowing that God is merciful, but also knowing that not anything goes in the house of the Father. I've recently just finished teaching a class on the Virgin Mary, mostly to my Protestant students at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I hope I'll be able to share with you some insights on why I think Mary, the mother of all, the mother of God, as well as our own biological mothers, and the witness of communities of the faithful, can help people to find everyday rituals of life that, combined with religious rituals, help give our emotions and our cries and our desires a meaning in relationship with a transcendent God. I've really come to believe that sacred rituals allow us to taste the possibility of purifying our own sinfulness and also finding redemption in unjust suffering so that we can sanctify both our joys and our wounds. Because, as I hope to explain a little bit more tonight, that these rituals help us to participate in something bigger than ourselves, which is a cry that I hear so much from young people. They want to participate in something bigger than themselves. And it's through this participation that's pointing them to the mysterious, which is not unknowable, but that being that's inexhaustible, to whom they can return to no matter what happens in life. So my journey in the academy started with majoring in psychology at Yale University, followed by 3 years where I worked for the Arias Foundation based in Costa Rica, but I spent about 3 years studying the reintegration into civilian life of former combatants of civil wars in Central America. And it was through that work that I became really interested in how individual people can be so resilient in the face of adversity. I met with people who had fought on both sides of the Civil War, had laid down their swords for plowshares, and were able to actually forgive these horrible offenses that had occurred in the context of civil war. Returning to graduate school in psychology at Princeton University, I wrote my dissertation on immigration from Haiti to the United States, Canada, and France. It was about when I was going to start my ethnographic work that I thought I would study these Haitian Catholic missions in Miami, Montreal, and Paris. It was pretty rare to find a mention of religion in the time at the literature on immigration, although historically it had been very central. But 1960s on literature on immigration focused on the socioeconomic adaptation of immigrants and less on their religious lives. That book, that dissertation, became a book called Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora. And after its publication, I was left with a set of questions about things I wanted to explore more deeply. Although I had argued in my book that religious communities provided people with social support and a source of hope and allowed this impoverished group of immigrants to find a community belonging and a path to adaptation in these new societies, there were ways in which I felt that the discipline of sociology, which I had been trained in, somewhat constrained me in how I could talk about people's experiences, because the focus was supposed to be on the economic adaptation. And to the extent faith mattered, it mattered because it promoted a kind of positive well-being. Now, all that is fine and dandy, and it makes some good sense, but it ended up sounding like I was saying things like the woman I interviewed who told me she had been raped as an act of political intimidation in Haiti, but chose to forgive her rapists. I ended up saying things like, well, that's good because it reduces her anxiety. Whereas what she was saying was that it was good to forgive because she cared about the salvation of their souls, and she was called to love them, even if they had harmed her. But that kind of logic of love didn't really quite fit with the language I thought I needed to use to be a sociologist, where the burden was really overturning this idea that religion makes people passive in the face of suffering. So I wanted to show that religion helped people. And so what I finally started to argue was that religion isn't only a source of resistance for the oppressed, it's a source of resilience, right? So I turned to the then burgeoning literature coming out of positive psychology, talking about resilience, bringing back this idea that suffering can be met in a way that allows people to develop new capacities and adapt and have even greater growth than they would have had they not had whatever that event was. So for my next project, I decided that I still wanted to study religion and resilience, but this time I wasn't going to study people already in a religious community. I wondered what's happening with all the people who are suffering from some kind of traumatic event and don't belong to a religious community and may not even be seeking treatment or counseling. Well, how do you find people who don't belong to a community, aren't seeking treatment, and aren't in counseling? It's a difficult sampling problem. Well, I came up with an idea. I approached the directors of the National Study of Youth and Religion, which had done a random digit dial across the country and interviewed 3,000 young adults and followed up with them over the years. So over the course of 10 years, they had followed up with them. They had their emails, their phone numbers, and their addresses. Plus, they had 4 rounds of survey data. So I spent hours with a graduate student in a closet called an office, crunching through the data to find the people who said they had the highest levels of trauma. And then I decided to go find them no matter where they were. Well, that took me to 10 states and 26 communities. Oftentimes, as you're about to hear, 5 or 6 hours from the nearest airport and barely on the map. What I did with the data before I went out on the study was I then wanted to identify outliers, right? So much of the field of statistics within psychology and sociology, we're always looking at averages. Well, guess what? There's the curve too, right? Not everybody's average. So I thought, let me look at the people who all had trauma, those who had the highest level of functioning, according to the survey afterwards, and those who had the lowest. Therefore, I can compare and figure out what makes people the most resilient, like what's missing in these people and what do others people have. Well, now let me tell you about 2 of the people that I met as a part of that project and why I ultimately realized the framework that I was using left aside some of the most important questions that I wanted to address. Renee bounced joyfully to meet me in a Taco Bell in the rural South, about 5 hours from the nearest airport where I had been driving all day. She gleefully told me about the Pentecostal church that she attended, where she read the gospel every day and served the needy in her community and went on mission trips. But what had brought Renee 5 hours away from her hometown to this church in the middle of nowhere, I wondered. I probed, asking her about her relationship with her mother. If you want to get young adults talking, ask them about their parents. She hesitated and said that she had had a falling out with her mom when she was 13. An experienced interviewer by the time, I knew from the tone of her voice and her sudden change in body language, something bad had happened. It just came out of my mouth. Did somebody hurt you? She then told me that when she was 13, her stepfather broke down and confessed to the police that he had been sexually abusing Renee for 5 years. He went to jail, so she was freed of the abuse, but she turned her anger first towards her mother for ignoring the signs of her pain, such as cutting herself with razor blades. She had been raised Southern Baptist, but began to curse God, and as she said, went down the path of an agnostic. When she got into high school, she got a fake ID and started buying her own alcohol at age 14. She took ecstasy, marijuana, pain pills, literally anything with hydrocodone, she told me. She slept around, and some of the men she slept with beat her and bruised her. No matter what she did, she couldn't get rid of her pain, and she wanted to end it all. So one night, she decided to drink herself to death. The last thing she recalls before passing out was that she cried out, "God, if you are real, show me." The next morning, a friend of her mother's called and said, "Renee, the Lord laid you on my heart. How are you doing?" And she invited Renee to a Pentecostal church where Renee heard about this other Pentecostal church that had a healing ministry. She went for a weekend and then moved back and became fully immersed in the life of this community. She experienced healing of memories, by which she said it's not like she doesn't remember what happened, but she can talk about what happened with ease and with grace. Her body, which had been struck with rheumatoid arthritis, also began to heal. Even some of the scars from cutting herself were fading. But most miraculously, perhaps, Renee said that one day she felt God calling her to forgive her stepfather. She has not seen him and does not plan on it, but she does say that she loves him and has forgiven him. She has a better relationship with her mother and prays that her mother also gets saved. Well, Renee's story was actually not very typical. Of the 26 young adults that I interviewed as part of this, it's a relatively small sample, but I looked at the national survey data and it was relatively similar, right? Of those 26, only 5 attended a church on a regular basis. Young adults are at a pretty low point in their life in terms of going to church. And I had also had this idea in my head that if people had a profound experience of God, then they would join a church. Well, what I found in most of the cases is that people actually had profound experiences of God, but they went on seeking, but not joining, and believing, but not belonging. And as my study design was set to find, I indeed found a lot of people who you couldn't call them anything other than being in chronic dysfunction. So I began to wonder, and at my second visit with Renee, as she was telling me about her mission trip to India and all the work she was doing with people in jail, I have the transcript of my interview with her, and I interrupted her and I blurted out a question that I guess I really wanted to ask her. And I said, well, but if God loves everybody, why isn't everybody healed? And she gave me a pretty good answer. She said, well, some people are in bondage and they're not ready to accept God's love. She said, but even if that's the case, I still love them because God loves people no matter what. And I shared with them my story of healing. And I tell them that this could be your story too, if you would allow it. So after that, I went with Renee the next morning to her Pentecostal church, where we had rock music and hand waving and testimonies and preaching about God's suffering and death on the cross for us, our need for conversion. And it was this effervescent emotional, spiritual ritual where I saw that people were bringing their pain and trying to lay it down in front of the cross. So what I think I learned from Renee is that I kept trying to fit her story into this language of kind of the effectiveness of faith to make change in people's lives. But Renee was using, like I had seen in my experience of Haitian immigrants, this language of love, that what matters about the faith is that God loves people. Whether or not everybody's healed according to the measures we come up with is really God's work. Our work, is what Renee said, is to love on people. So what she emphasized is that her personal prayer and these rituals are fundamentally about expressing a relationship with God, whose presence really blesses us, whether we see it or not. Now, it's not that faith is never effective, because why would Renee keep on praying if she hadn't actually seen that God is active in her life? She has. It's just that God's logic doesn't go by our logic of like, if you pray 22 times, you're going to see this. And if you pray 23 times, oops, that's too much. You overdid it. Done. That's not the way it works. So I've struggled to rethink my entire project because I was so focused on outcomes that I really didn't know what to do with the narratives of people who had chronic dysfunction, like Jason. one of the many people I interviewed who had long battles with alcohol and drugs. I first met Jason in a small town public library in the Northeast. He strolled in with his pants hanging down below his hips, covered in tattoos, and tattooed on his knuckles, long lost. And on his forearm, La vida loca, crazy life. He told me about how when he was in high school, he began drinking almost every day. His friends called him a buzz hound because he chased a buzz no matter what it was. And by the time he was in his 20s, he had moved on to pain pills and then on to heroin, which brought him to his knees, he said, very fast. He hit rock bottom trying to find a vein in his arm in a McDonald's. Got his mother to give him money one more time, had a really great high, and checked into rehab. By the time I met him, he had been sober for 5 years. He had met a woman that he was deeply in love with. He called her the love of his life. They had a child, and he said the child was all that mattered to him. When he came out of rehab, he studied tattoo art, which he called a brotherhood, an apprenticeship that was like a brotherhood. And he talked about his tattoo clients and the kind of sacred work he would do with them and expressing their deepest ideas and identities on their bodies in color and image. He had a lot of hope for the future. But knowing how difficult it can be to stay sober, I wondered what would happen to Jason. When I called him 2 years later, he said we could meet at a rest stop, and he would come as soon as he got out of his very brief, quick stop by the doctor's office in the morning. When he showed up, what I had feared the doctor's appointment about was true. He had just come from a methadone clinic, which is an outpatient treatment for heroin addicts. He told me that his girlfriend had relapsed on heroin. He followed suit not long after. She had gone to an in-person rehab, an intensive in-person rehab, but he wanted to keep working, so he went into the methadone clinic. She came out of rehab, but she then had a relapse of her bipolar disorder, which led her to kick him out of the house. So they broke up. He found another girlfriend who also had mental health problems and treated him horribly and actually sent somebody to beat him up. So he just kept talking about how his life was in utter chaos and he just wanted some inner peace. Not knowing what to say to Jason, I said, well, have you ever felt that inner peace? And he said, well, yeah, there was one time when I came out of rehab, I was sitting there and I saw a beautiful sunset. And it just made me think that there's got to be something bigger than myself out there. But you know, when I look inside of myself, all I see is ugliness. You know, I'm not innocent. I've told myself so many lies. I don't even know what I would find if I went inside of myself. So I asked him, well, what do you think that being that's bigger than yourself thinks about your situation? And he said, well, you know, if there is a God, he doesn't really want me to suffer anymore because, believe me, the drugs and the addiction have made me suffer so much that I don't believe there's a God trying to make me suffer more. He said, and you know, then he explained to me that although he had never set foot inside of a church, he had quite a sense of humor. He's like, you know, I'm just not sure some guy with a black suit on, a little white piece of paper, knows anything more about life than me. Very funny. He said, but I wanted my daughter to be baptized. And I said, oh yeah, what kind of church it was? He said, I don't know. Maybe it was Catholic. I'm like, well, if he was wearing a white piece of paper, it's a good guess. Yeah. It definitely was Catholic. Yeah. Okay. But you know what he said? He said, but I want my daughter to go to Sunday school. And I want her to know that God has a law. And if she breaks the law, he's going to smite her. I won't say it. Because I didn't have that kind of upbringing. You know, nobody told me right from wrong. And I want her to have it. Okay. By the way, when I looked up Jason a few years later to see if he was still around, all of his pictures on Instagram were of tattoo arts, except a little girl in a white dress making her first communion. There's a purity in the midst of this chaos that he has an image of. he told me, I guess I've been more spiritual than religious. I followed him to his tattoo parlor. I'd actually never been to a tattoo parlor. I don't have any tattoos. I was curious. By the way, he told me he doesn't like women with tattoos. He advised me not to get any. Although he was very proud of the work that he does. He said that he didn't think I needed any because I knew who I was, and people are getting tattoos because they're trying to figure out who they are. And if you figure that out, you can skip the whole tattooing thing. He had a strong sense that the religious art he was doing, the rosaries and the Jesus and the Mary, that was all great. And that the woman who made him, he showed me a picture, tattoo on her lip, "I love New Jersey," that was not great art. But I spent an afternoon with him, watching him depict people's stories right on their own bodies. And I saw him get into what positive psychology calls flow, right? That for those few hours when he's in the tattoo parlor, he's engaging in an activity that takes him out of himself, where time stops, where his troubles stop, and where he's manually engaging in a creative act, which, although in some ways he says isn't for everybody, it's his way of finding flow and finding some connection to whatever that thing is that's bigger than himself. So the kinds of questions I was left with was, and I did publish these papers where I labeled, a subset of my study as being in chronic dysfunction. And, we don't have anything to say about them other than that they need to, get off their alcohol or drugs, all that stuff. You could advise Jason Seinfeld, he doesn't know that, right? I also struggled with, well, what do I make of his faith experience, right? He doesn't read the Bible. He doesn't really give authority to the guy with the black jacket and, but he does have a sense of some sort of divine presence, and he does use this language of the sacred. So what on earth do we make of that? And from a more practical perspective, how would we bring someone like Jason or someone in chronic dysfunction, the many people I met, how would we bring them to experience the kinds of rituals where Renee found so much healing? So I began to study sacred and secular rituals. And what I want to try to share with you tonight are some thoughts that I have about what it would take to restore a Catholic anthropology, by which I don't mean just a philosophical anthropology, as important as it is, but a Catholic cultural anthropology that's historical and ethnographic and is open to understanding the human experience of liminality, of experiencing chaos, but also seeking a kind of home. And from that, what are some rituals of initiation and belonging, which can respond to this kind of human sense that there's an existential chaos out there, but also points people to that mysterious, to that sacred. I also think that this Catholic anthropology that I'll talk about tonight can help us rescue us from some of the misuses of the word solidarity, right? Solidarity often means taking the pie and dividing it evenly. If you have pie after this talk, I want the biggest piece. But my point being that Renee's understanding of solidarity was about participating in something bigger than herself, which leads to a superabundance of love. And I think this is actually what the Catholic understanding of solidarity is. That as much as I would like to split the pie evenly with you or to split all the goods evenly, in reality, the logic of love tells us that the goods of the earth are actually superabundant, fruitful, overflowing. And I believe that Catholic cultural anthropology tells us that the kinds of rituals that Renee participates in and that I myself have participated in, which I'll tell you about, spread that love in a mysterious way, but in a way that I do believe can help restore order to the chaos of people's lives, like Jason. As I mentioned in my own work on Haitian immigrants, I have to admit, I was sometimes swept up by the fervor with which they celebrated holy days. Easter weekend being one, perhaps absolutely the most important, but not only that, there were Eucharistic processions, outdoor stations of the cross, entire days dedicated to praying the rosary. Whether it was in Haiti or in Miami, it's like burning hot, and they're doing these rituals outdoors. In Montreal or Paris, I would see these Haitian men and women climbing upstairs on their knees in the freezing cold to bring their petitions before some sort of a shrine. At the same time, they held artistic festivals, making flower arrangements, special clothes, hosting feasts. These are people who are on the brink of survival that may or may not have a lot of food at home, but they have flowers and they have food to share. The sociological tools I had at the time that I observed these rituals mostly came from Emile Durkheim and Max Weber, which, although are useful and I like teaching their theories, I felt that they had little or maybe nothing to say about the presence of a divine mystery in the midst of these rituals. A presence that, as I'll share with you at the end of my talk, a presence that I felt in these rituals, and in fact, a presence that changed me. Perhaps the best way that I get my students to think about the psychodrama of religious and secular rituals is, hands down, the most favorite book I've taught in the last 6 years is Robert Orsi's Madonna of 115th Street. In this book, Robert Orsi describes the festa, which from the late 1800s to about 1950 was a multi-day, sometimes a week-long festival in honor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel that happened in July. The first chapter of the book is a beautiful historical ethnography that he constructed through oral histories and reading archives. And he describes the smells of the sausages and the nuts everywhere, the people getting dressed up, the men in suits, the women crawling on their knees before the statue of this woman, thousands of people on the street of East Harlem, with the African Americans from West Harlem looking on, the Jews looking on, and the Irish policemen keeping watch. He talks about the commitment to this devotion where people would offer up their requests and their sorrows laden with candles and petitions. What I find really interesting as a scholar is to read his reflection in the preface to the third edition of this best-selling book, where he says that what he has learned as an historian of American religion is that the field of history has struggled to see what he believes the people in his study really perceived, which was the presence of the divine in these rituals. For historical accounts of religion at the time he was doing this work, and I'd say largely still today, see religion as part of the larger story of the working out of economic material forces in history, where everything can be reduced to power, and this devotion to Mary is just the playing out of these larger struggles around power. So obviously, for an historian at the time of these, Italian Americans who are discriminated against, they're on the brink of survival. What they're doing in these devotions is expressing their anguish over their misery. What Orsi says is that the problem with that interpretation is that it reduces everything about religious experience to nothing other than an expression of a material reality. And in so doing, eradicates the meaning of the event for the people in it. Which for them, he argues, is that the festa puts together their human experiences and their experiences of the divine. That Mary, the Virgin Mary, is a real presence in their life. And the problem with history, reducing everything to the material, is that it's emptied out the meaning of the sign. And the sign is that the material reality we participate in, and even our sufferings and our pains, can point us to the presence of the mysterious. Now, it's also not that the people who are bringing their needs and their requests to Mary, they don't have the instrumentalist logic that I did when I was talking to Renee. They know that not all their prayers are going to get answered, at least in the way that they expect them to be. But they know that that doesn't mean that the divine is not a part of their life. So the kind of solidarity you see in these rituals is a solidarity not just amongst humans, which is what Durkheim talked about. I mean, Durkheim is right. In a way, these rituals, the Italian-American community is coming to know itself as an Italian-American community. That's a part of the story. But you see, there's a solidarity that's happening too between heaven and earth. Because the participation in these rituals, it's both about the community finding and defining itself, as well as continuing to make presence that divine reality. The human, the mother of God, the food, it's not separate from the sacred. It leads people to the sacred. So Orsi says, these Italian Americans, you have to understand, they were still in awe of what he calls the mysterium tremendum, that before God we approach with reverence and with awe, aware of our sinfulness and our own need for conversion, and that to enter the house of the Father requires discipline and respect. So the festa fuses the sacred and the profane. The food and the emotion and the noise doesn't take away from the presence of the sacred. It lifts the mundane realities up to the sacred, so that later on, when they're in their kitchens and their child is hurt or someone's far away, they can lift up their cries and know that in that moment, the heavenly will come down. Because Christ's redeeming blood established an intimacy between heaven and their family, so that no concern is too small. But at the same time, because they know that the house of the Father demands respect, what God proposes in his laws, humans must respect. But we can still entreat him like a father if we don't understand his ways. So he concludes the book with this beautiful paragraph that these people took all the hope and pain of their lives and brought them to a divine mother who lived not only in the faith of their present, but in the faith of their past as well, as she merged in their memories with their own mothers. They carried this into her house, which they built. On the streets and in the homes they sanctified, they prayed to be healed of the hurts they knew would come on those streets and in those homes. They begged to be nurtured another year. And they knew the path to the divine was the same dense and trying and joyous and painful path they trod every day. Why does this book move my students so much? There's many reasons I think it moves students so much, but one student who is a military chaplain who's done several tours of duty in zones of combat, he just said at the end of reading this book and a few other books, he just said, I think sometimes people show up in the pews at church and they just want to know that God blesses them. Whatever they've been through, whatever they can't fix, whoever they are, they just want to feel that their stories are somehow blessed. Another student wrote, because before and after, I sometimes do this in class, right? So tell me what you think this book is about at the start of class. And at the end of class, what do you think this book is about? The start of class, this young woman was really interested in Italian-American history and what they ate and how they dressed and where they came from and how many of them there were. And her dad had grown up in Harlem and he'd actually heard of this festival. At the end of class, here's what she wrote. She said, actually, this book is about the Virgin Mary, who brings people together because everyone can identify with the suffering mother of Jesus, who was without sin. Devotion to Mary is about practices that make the absent present and symbolizes a moment of transcendent unity that embodies a divine presence of community. It's because my students talk so enthusiastically about this Robert Orsi book, I shared some of these thoughts with my neighbor, who's an historian of late antiquity. His name is Peter Brown. He wrote a biography of St. Augustine called Augustine of Hippo. He writes largely about the transition of Christianity from basically a subset of Jews to a state religion. And I shared with him some of this. And in fact, some of our conversations are now going to be part of a book, which I'm publishing this summer with Clooney Media, called The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education. And in Peter's chapter, which opens up the book, it's a dialogue between me and Peter. And I asked him to share some of his insights on rituals and beauty in early Christianity. And here's what he said. Well, he says, like paganism and Judaism, late antique Christianity was a religion of high holidays, and most notably Easter and the feasts of the martyrs. The grand occasions took place at night in the form of vigils. The great basilicas were designed for the movement of great crowds, for solemn processions to and from the altar. He explained that the pavements of these great basilicas were covered with roses and sweet-smelling herbs. The entire building around the courtyard would have been filled with light. The alabaster windows of those basilicas, he explained, were placed there to let light stream out into the darkness. Unlike the later Gothic cathedrals where the light would come into the church, these churches were built to be like a great lantern on the hill. The aesthetics of High Festival, he explains, meant more in expressing the joy of Christianity than any self-consciously worked out cycles of Christian iconography. As in the pagan and the Jewish world, it would be at such moments of high, light-filled drama that Christians of all classes, sexes, and ages shared in the triumph over the death of Christ and his martyrs. What this understanding of ritual, I think, helps us see is that perhaps a Christian understanding of solidarity has certainly something to do with what he says, Christians of all classes, sexes, and ages coming together, not in a way that the social divisions are irrelevant, but that you simply can't reduce the meaning of these rituals to a kind of mechanical solidarity. The commemoration of the martyrs, the mediation of the saints, and the passion of Jesus at Easter give us a glimpse of our possibility to triumph over those social divisions and experience a solidarity born of a common participation in an experience of the divine. I think it was this common participation in an experience of the divine which allowed me to do the kind of work that I did in the Haitian Catholic community. People often ask me, well, what was it like to study a community that's really different than you? And you can answer that with the whole insider-outsider debate. But although I cannot say to have suffered the types of things that I saw in the communities I studied in Haiti or Central America, much less Jason, you can participate in something that's bigger than what divides us. And I think that rituals are an extremely important way in which we do that. Peter Brown told me that his understanding of the social drama of rituals had been influenced by the British cultural anthropologist Victor Turner. Victor Turner actually converted to Catholicism later in his life. In his early career, he wrote about rituals of conflict in Africa. After his conversion to Catholicism, he wrote about modern day pilgrimages, Our Lady of Guadalupe and Our Lady of Lourdes. Another scholar in Princeton who was a personal friend has also helped me understand the history of rituals and solidarity was Albert Rabateau. Al Rabateau was born in Louisiana in the 1940s, an African-American Catholic. He studied English as an undergraduate and history and religion for his PhD at Yale. His first book was called, which was his dissertation, was called Slave Religion, where he looked at oral histories of slaves to understand their experience of God under slavery and their conversion to slavery. Again, towards the end of his life and giving some talks on his work, he just insisted that the point he was trying to make in slave religion was that historians said that either religion had to be an instrument to combat worldly oppression, or otherwise it made people accommodate to their oppressors. And that Al's entire career had been trying to show that the slaves saw a third way. The slaves who converted to Christianity understood the Bible to say that in their unjust suffering, if they prayed for their abusers, that forgiveness might be the mechanism through which God would use to save not just their own descendants from the scourge of slavery, but save the American nation itself from the scourge of slavery. In my own words, what I saw Al recounting in Slave Religion and his other works was that the slaves saw in the Christian doctrine of redemptive suffering. They saw their own stories reflected in the biblical stories of the exiled Israelis. And in that story saw the possibility not just for group solidarity among the oppressed, but for a solidarity that extended to their oppressors, holding them accountable before God, before their sins, but not ejecting them from the house of the Father, calling them back from their sinfulness and offering forgiveness as an act of moral superiority. When I moved back to Princeton about 6 years ago, one morning outside of Mass at St. Paul's, I saw Al Rabateau. I had actually never had a conversation with him. I introduced myself, told him about my work, and we started going to coffee on a pretty regular basis. At this point, Al was retired from teaching, but still writing quite actively. I shared with him the writing I did about Jason and Renee and others. And what he told me he liked about my writing was that I kept their human voice there with all the complexities and sometimes the incoherences and the unfinished stories. Because as an English major, Al was always a storyteller. And in reality, human life has the structure of a story, of a narrative. There are turning points, there's moments of conversion, there's backsliding, but there's always an unfinished kind of sense to human life. And what he and I shared was the sense that the disciplines we had studied, in his case, history and me, sociology, wanted to close everything inside of a system that didn't leave open some of these questions or leave open the possibility that the divine can actually enter into history. And that in fact, if you take people's accounts of their lives, this is what they experience. And I kept hearing this again and again, that people experience some kind of divine presence, even in the midst of incredible suffering and without necessarily being people who called themselves believers or churchgoers. But most people outside of the academy are not materialist rationalists. They're not. They see their lives as full of significance, and they see the material world as having signs. And in fact, what Orsi says, and I think what Alice told me and my struggles with my field, is that it takes a lot of academic language to pull that out of human experience. But this is what we largely do, I think, to our own detriment. Al also moved me on a human level because he shared some of his own struggles as an academic. One of his books that I like to assign is called A Sorrowful Joy. It's only about 60 pages. It's a personal memoir that he delivered as a lecturer at Harvard. Never thought it would be published, but now everybody reads it. And in that, he talks about how he drifted from his Catholic faith, never really rejecting it, but getting really caught up in the 1960s liberation movement, moving up the academic career. He became really famous for his book, became dean of the graduate school. But he lost, in some ways, his tie to his faith, and his family life ended up breaking up. He divorced. He was really regretful over the events that led to that divorce, and he felt terrible about himself and could barely go on with his work. One day, Princeton University Art Museum had an exhibit of Russian icons, and he went in and was simply mesmerized by an image of Our Lady. He said that he was moved by her sad, loving eyes, and he went and found an Orthodox liturgy and just felt overwhelmed by the beauty of the liturgy. What he writes about in A Sorrowful Joy is how this Orthodox liturgy that he practiced for most of the rest of his life, while also still going to Catholic church, he felt the presence of the ancestors and the martyrs as a real presence of communion with him in his life. And the walking in and the robes and the lights and the processions seemed to him to remind him of African-American spirituality, not just in the Catholic tradition, but largely in the Protestant tradition, which is what he wrote about, which emphasizes gestures, bodily rituals, communion across space and time, the real presence of the saints, and the possibility of redemptive suffering. because as what he saw as the parallel between Orthodoxy and African-American religion was that the suffering of Christ and the martyrs is at the center of the Christian tradition, and suffering grounds the Christian to suffering in the world. As the old slaves knew, he wrote, suffering can't be evaded, for it is the mark of the authenticity of faith. Through liturgy and prayer and procession, suffering can become like wounds of beauty that link us to a sacramental vision of the world tied to the beauty of nature, the sacralization of time in the liturgical seasons, he wrote, and the sensuous beauty of matter reflecting the glory of spirit, the living connection of my person to those who had gone before, the refusal of my people to let injustice strike down their souls and demand their human dignity, the old people's example of gentleness, hospitality, and kindness. Al and I talked about how difficult it is to have a conversation about forgiveness and mercy and compassion today. But one of the things that I want to try to close with is that I think what we can learn from Orsi and from my students' reaction to Orsi is that young people are really eager to find a culture of reverence. Even Jason, in all of his chaos, is looking for some image of purity. He's looking for some being that's bigger than himself, that's outside of himself, that's going to help him face the darkness inside of himself. So I think as Al Rabateau, Peter Brown, Robert Orsi, Victor Turner, Mary Douglas, and other cultural anthropologists have shown is that I think there are ways in which the everyday rituals of life can be connected to the drama of religious rituals, where our emotions, our cries, and our desires are lifted up to a transcendent God, allowing us to taste the possibility of purifying our sinfulness and sanctifying our joys and our sufferings. To end with a couple of personal reflections, in my own work, I've tried to share these insights with my students in the classroom as well as outside of the classroom. But first of all, I'll tell you what I told Renee. Well, I turned off the recorder at the end of our second interview, and I told her that I thought her story about her healing was really important because although I had never written about it, as part of my ethnographic work in the Haitian community, I one time went to observe a charismatic healing service in a closed small room. Well, at the end of that service, they called me up to the middle to pray over me. And what went through my mind was, I'm not worthy. But I'm telling you, the people who prayed over me had a power to see what was in my heart and what I needed. I left that night knowing there was something really real going on, but not quite ready to accept it. Around that time, I was finishing my dissertation, which was a lonely journey, especially because I had lost my father. And I was wondering just why was I doing all of this? What did this all add up to? Fortunately, a friend told me that there were some Catholic counselors out there. So I found one she actually happens to be on the faculty of Divine Mercy University. So I found a good Catholic counselor who helped me think about forgiveness and mercy and rethink some of my own life and work through my dissertation struggles. And when I went on and got a job as a professor, I wanted to try to share some of these insights with students. So I started a mentorship group at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill called Inspiring Women. First speaker I had was a Catholic counselor who went to Divine Mercy. And she talked about how she saw so many professional women who are overdeveloped rationally and underdeveloped emotionally. Exhibit A right here. So I thought, well, if I want to break the cycle of kind of passing on this kind of life of anxiety, what can I do? So I read, at her suggestion, Conrad Bahr's Feeling and Healing the Emotions, and I started inviting my friends to museums and walks on nature. You know, most of my friends don't share my faith or aren't Catholics, not going to come with me to Sunday ritual. But I started finding experiences of beauty that I could bring into my friendships and into my mentorship. I started hosting students for dinners because hospitality and friendship simply opens up the human, which then lets students connect with their deeper desires and talk about it. That's why when I moved to Yale University and was living with students, living in an undergraduate dorm, I started a reading group on happiness. And I had all these students show up and I found out they're all there because they're pretty miserable. But they desired happiness. But what was missing? What was missing? And the number one thing missing, I think, was a participation in a community where they felt at home and they could be themselves and bring all their vulnerabilities and all their emotions and experience a participation in a common destiny that's not competitive and it's not divisive. So what I've also tried to do, and I don't have time to go into all this all the night, I began to study the literature on beauty, which led me to Roger Scruton, to many others who are trying to kind of bring back a rich philosophy of aesthetics and the beauty of everyday life. And I've tried to develop practices, habits, which share those small little bits of beauty, whether that be a walk in nature or a visit to a museum, and to be open to the mysterious presence of signs in the midst of that, and to let those signs be a Christian hope, which is not always going to be a solution to your problem, because sometimes those solutions are pretty hard, but simply a sense that God is present with you in your suffering. And I have found that most people are like Jason. They're willing to believe that in the midst of their terrible suffering, there just might be a being who loves them. You see, I really think people are looking for a home. They're looking for a mother, a nurturing figure, someone who can help them face their self-alienation or alienation by their circumstances. So I think retreats, mission trips for those of us who are in communities of faith can be a really important way to encourage people to be with each other and to be changed in ways that we don't expect. I did go back another time to a charismatic healing service that a friend invited me to with a priest named Father de Grandis. And I can't tell you what happened in that experience, but I can tell you when I walked out, I didn't feel the same as when I walked in. Something of what he said, and again, his powers to heal through his words and his preaching and the Eucharist. And I took my mostly Protestant students to a Franciscan Friars of the Renewal service. You know what they liked the most? The healing service. Kneeling down in front of the cross and being prayed over really resonated with them. I've also written about my pilgrimage to Fatima, where, again, I forget all these lessons and I go back to my rationalist ways and I think, oh, I don't need to do what all these people are doing. I'm just gonna go have a lot of gelatos and hang out in Portugal and I don't know. Well, day 2, I threw myself down on my knees, even though I had a bad injury from a car accident. And I'm telling you, there was something about that, sacrifice of my bodily comfort that led to some kind of spiritual conversion, which led me to then land from my trip and decide to take a 30-day fast from alcohol. In part, it was a kind of solidarity with a friend who is not able to control her alcohol at all. So I thought I would do this fast. And well, guess what? 2.5 years later, I'm still fasting, and she's still not fasting. And I've tried now, having built up a little stamina, to do a kind of serious fast during Lent. I knew something was wrong a couple years ago when I really couldn't even do the Friday fast. It was bad. I don't know. So I think there's something to these voluntary sacrifices that are of kind of solidarity with people who are suffering. And when I left Jason, I couldn't fix his problems, but I did promise him I would pray for him. And most people who I've ever met who are going through something, whether they believe in God or not, they're open to hearing that and they want to believe that it works. There's something about the human person that wants to believe we can have a communion with others across time and across space and with the dead. And sometimes that's the only thing you can say. as in the case of two friends of mine who've lost their husbands to suicide. That said, I also think there's ways that the beauty of the Orthodox liturgy and the Catholic liturgy that we have as people of faith, as well as the Protestant traditions and other traditions, can be brought into the everyday. So when I, just give an example, when I heard that Al Rabateau was close to death, I went to visit him at his home. And I brought him my favorite icon of Mary. And he could barely speak, but he managed to say, "Thank you. That's beautiful." Then I prayed Psalm 50, which is a psalm of God's merciful love. And then I thought I would ask Al, "Hey, how can I pray for you?" And he replied very faintly. He said, "Pray for others. Pray for the suffering." The solidarity I had with Al was certainly intellectual, but it was deeply personal. At the end of his life, in those few words, it was a reminder that we're both participating in a story that's greater than our lives or even our death. And that through these rituals that we shared in life, we can go on connecting. And I truly believe that about my father and many other loved ones who I have lost. I also believe, as I've said tonight, that mostly secular fields of history and sociology, psychology, economics, the methods and approaches of those fields can shed really important lights on the nature of who we are as human persons. But they can't answer the deepest existential questions about what is that being that people perceive and desire to be present in their everyday realities. And ultimately, the word resilience is really no longer the only word I want to have in my vocabulary, as important as it is, and as important as I think it is to know the tools that make people resilient. It's also really important to know that some amount of suffering is unavoidable, but it's not meaningless. And I believe that a revival of Catholic cultural anthropology will help get us to a better understanding of the sacred and the secular rituals that will generate a deeper kind of solidarity grounded in a logic of love, where the cross is a paradox, but it's a sign of love that can speak to a world badly in need of healing and forgiveness and compassion. Thank you.
Do you want to just begin addressing some of the questions that have come in? Would you like to take a little break?
I can, if you have some water, that'd be great. But if I could start with, a little bit of humor about one of these questions. Here we go, right to the point. Are you living an integrated life? And if so, what would you say to Divine Mercy University about living an integrated life? Now, are you living an integrated life? Well, most days I feel like Jason, like I'm just kind of in chaos. But I will share with you that there's no question that in the last 15 years, having studied the things that I've studied and met the people that I've met, that I've made baby steps towards being more integrated. I would say that my life is more integrated in terms of the distribution of my time. So that's like step number one. I don't know, I have this problem where if I'm not like super busy, I get a little anxious. That's a problem. So learning to be content when I'm not super busy, and learning to be content when I should be super busy, and I just have to say no. It is an ongoing iterative process. But I will tell you that I am no longer on the edge of burnout, which I did feel like I was when I was doing my dissertation. And I see so many graduate students going through it. And I think it's really sad. And I think we almost sanctify that as a ritual, right? That being a miserable, unhappy academic is a rite of passage. It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, I would say what I could say to Divine Mercy about living an integrated life is, well, one, which I already observe here, that there should be breaks in the day where something's not scheduled. I think it's important to have times in the day where something's not scheduled. I would also say that part of living an integrated life, you have to work on your interior life, or at least for me. I mean, I have what I think St. Teresa of Avila calls monkey brain. Or like my brain is like that one comedian says, it's like the internet superhighway. Everything's connected to everything and everything's shooting around the same time. Finding internal peace. I actually recommend to people the book, The Mindful Catholic. And I read it with a group of my students and it really helped. So I think the mindfulness, again, the book is very clear. These are techniques. It's not prayer, but it can help prepare you for prayer. Because the problem I had, I'd say about 3 years ago, I felt that even when I made time for prayer, I was so busy that I couldn't enter into it. This is a problem. And I think for that, you actually need physical time off and you need internal peace. So what I would say is that if you keep practicing, you should be getting better at it. And if you're not getting better at it, you're not practicing the right thing. That's what I'd say. Another question about some of the influences on my work. Someone asked whether John Paul II's Salvifici Doloris played a role. I would actually say, although as important as that is, the one that I've used is actually Pope Benedict XVI's Spe Salvi, In Hope We Are Saved. I've used that to talk about, again, the problem that the modern world has with the confusion between hope and optimism. I also see this confusion a little bit in the field of psychology. I mean, optimism is a good thing, but Christian hope is not the same as optimism, right? Christian hope is what I've described tonight, which is the presence of a divine reality, even in the midst of suffering, which is not a sense that I can get control of this or everything's going to get better. So again, what I think Spe Salvi has helped me do is that, see, one of the meta narratives, I know here you have the meta model, right? Well, what is your meta model competing with? Your meta model here of the Christian person, Christian Catholic, Christian anthropology, is competing with a meta model of progress, I think, on the one hand, and nihilism on the other hand. This is what I see. So on the one hand, there's this sense of like, we can just get everything right, and then there's going to be forward progress, and everything is kind of, that history itself is a linear development towards the good, just intrinsically, without the divine, by the way, just it is. The other side of that is like, are you kidding me? We're just a bunch of losers, and this is all, it's all very Nietzschean, very dark. So I find that, again, I don't know, don't ask me why I do this to random people on the airplane, but I do sometimes. They're like, so what do you do? And I'm like, I study, I don't know. Last week I was talking to a heroin addict. Oh, wow. And guess what? People always want to have compassion with addicts. But I kind of then challenge them, well, I don't know, I just try this out on strangers just to see what they do, and they usually look shocked. But I say things like, well, at the end of the day, heroin addicts are a tremendous drain on society because they take up a lot of resources. People look at me. I'm like, maybe some people maybe we should just let them go. And, and nobody wants to say this, but again, in the circles I run in, you see, there's actually quite a lot of utilitarianism. And people are actually seriously posing this question. Why do we spend so much of our money to care for the disabled and the addicts? Guess what? They're not going to be productive. They're not going to add to the solidarity of our economic pot. What do you do with those people? So we do live, I think, in a time where the secular world really, truly, genuinely believes in compassion. But I think they ultimately sometimes don't really know how to justify it. And they don't know what to do when they're face to face with a young person who says, no, like the young people I'm talking to, no, I deserve to die. I'd rather be dead. what do you say? They don't have a message of hope and compassion because it's all about like, well, how can I fix you? And I've met a lot of students from a secular background who don't want somebody to fix them. They want something to believe in, and they want something they can belong to. And that's different than being fixed. So here are some other good questions. How does church define or identify poverty versus destitution? How does distinguishing these help us to serve? Well, I would answer that question. Again, I don't want to speak authoritatively here, but I would say that there are certainly ways in which all of us are called to voluntary forms of poverty, right? Voluntary renunciation. I honestly think this is the aspect of poverty. I think it's we don't talk about very much. I mean, we live in one of the most materially comfortable societies I think that's ever existed. So I think we need to talk about poverty as something that all of us need to practice during these times of Lent in particular ways. Now, the destitution of truly not having enough material goods absolutely exists in this country. It exists more outside of this country. But I will tell you that what I have experienced, and I think others have experienced, is that people who live in destitution and in true want of material goods can still have a whole heck of a lot of dignity. And that's what I think the church tells us. That poverty or destitution doesn't mean people don't have dignity, and it doesn't mean that people don't have agency. So how can these help us better serve? I mean, again, some of my role models are people who are serving the destitute, people who are homeless in this country, people who are struggling with addictions. I think that we can, part of the reason I gave the example of Jason is that, of course, it's important to address his physical issues around addiction, but we also have to address him as a whole person. And simply because somebody is living in a state of destitution or lack of material goods doesn't mean that they're not a person who wants to be treated with dignity. And this is what I think our faith tells us. Again, it's not either or, right? It's both and. So, this is a tough question, how to reconcile the so-called love of God with the dreadful suffering around us. I've talked about this a lot with friends of mine who are teachers and who work with young people or people who've lost a loved one to suicide, or now we have, of course, a war going on in the Ukraine. What I try to do, right, if people really want to have the existential questions about the problem of evil, I think we need to have room to have those questions. At the same time, I do think we need to lead people in a way that they come to believe that their everyday activities are contributing to a kind of material order and a supernatural order. Because to conclude that because there's unjust suffering or suffering I can't control, that my effort and my life is meaningless and there's nothing I can do, is contributing, I think, to this kind of existential nihilism. And I understand that maybe when people are first encountering some of these problems of long suffering, there can be a temptation to say, well, how can God allow this? And I think Renee went through that. People I've interviewed went through that. But ultimately, we are human beings that participate in the creating of order through everything we do with our daily actions, and helping people to see that no matter what's going on, there's something they can do. And if they themselves are sick or disabled, well, they can pray. And in fact, gets to one of these other questions. This is extremely difficult, but I think people who are suffering so much that they can't do things, either, again, they're disabled, they're close to death, being near people who are in that situation and helping them see that in that moment, the only thing they can do is sanctify their suffering, but that in doing that, somehow mysteriously, that's going to bring a greater good into the world. Now, again, the person you're talking to has to be ready to hear that. If they are ready to hear it, you can say it. If they're not ready to hear it, which is completely normal and natural, you can pray for them. And if you get the chance to see them in their suffering, they can see in you whether or not you have that hope. So that's what I say. And I think that actually, you know, someone also asked about people who are dying and how to help people who are dying. Well, first of all, I would say that people who are dying don't want to be dying alone. And people who know someone who's dying, who love someone who's dying, need to face their fears of seeing death and go see them. And the people I've been close to who are suffering and dying, I've really come to believe that in the end of life, there is a lot going on. A lot is happening spiritually. And anybody I know who's been next to someone as they're dying is never the same again. Because in these moments of passing on, again, it's another place in which we see heaven and earth meeting. And people perceive this and they feel this and they're changed by it. They're changed by it. So shielding people from the suffering and the dying is not the way to go.
Dr. Mooney Suarez, I wonder if we might also invite a question.
Sure.
From the room.
Please. Yes.
I have one. It's about the following. I was thinking of Jason and others like Jason. They probably walk by churches and they see them and they say to themselves something like, well, they're already a group. They know what they know how to pray. They have a ritual. There's an organization there that it's a barrier to me, the fact that they're already integrated into a community. And that what I need is somebody, a group that's more open, that is sort of a transition group, a group that could, where if I went to it, I wouldn't feel that I didn't know when to stand and how to cross myself and all the rest. But that nevertheless, we would be discussing the issues of the divine or of the presence of God in people's lives in a way that would be, in other words, could there be a kind of introductory ritual to the Mass? That is a kind of transition ritual that could serve to, that was much more open to people coming into it, but still had a ritualistic character and implied that when you left it, you could go to Mass again, or you and continue, or you could go someplace else, but that it was an introduction to a ritual understanding of the divine in your life.
Well, I'll answer that in two ways. So the question for the audience online, if you didn't hear, was what, you know, for someone like Jason, who's never been to a Catholic Mass or any other kind of church service, they may not want to go in because it seems so unfamiliar to them. Yeah. So what other kinds of rituals might be an introduction for them? I would say two things, Paul. First of all, I would say that a lot of people are coming in to Christian churches via Pentecostal traditions like that of Renee, where the liturgy appears to be, it doesn't follow such a structured pattern, it doesn't presume a lot of knowledge, and it's emotionally, bodily, very engaged. And the charismatic evangelical Pentecostal movement is very strong for people who are in need of healing. It speaks to them in immediate sense. So I think for communities like Renee, what's the process from somebody coming in and visiting and staying is a different question. Because what ends up happening, and this happens of course in Catholic churches too, is that people come for a while and then they drift. So kind of participating and committing are different things. And for people like Jason, what ends up happening is they might go for a little while, but their life is so out of control that, you know, they lose their car, they lose their job, and they can't get there anymore, and then they're back to nothing, right? So people are sort of drifting in and out. Catholic Mass is not always as apparent or easy to figure out what's going on. You know, Paul, I thought a lot about this. I would say images are a great way. There's something about the power of sacred images. So for someone like Jason, I mean, where is he going to walk in off the street and go see, you know, an icon of the Virgin Mary or something? But, you know, he is an artist, and people do have an intrinsic interest in art. And I think you have an intrinsic interest in art, Paul. So I think, and I've seen this with people that I work with, that art speaks right to their heart. Now, you need then educators, whether those are religious leaders or art teachers, who are doing, who can explain this to them. I thought too about the whole kind of coffee shop model. You know, recovering addicts need a lot of coffee. It's kind of a stereotype, but it's sort of true. So what about a coffee shop where, you know, I mean, where there's sacred images, where there might be an opportunity for a chanting of the Psalms, but really where the focus is on a beautiful environment and some kind of hospitality. And then what if, you know, a lay person or, you know, a guy, you know, the priest happened to be there, maybe offer a little bit of healing for those who are ready, and some way of integrating a kind of, maybe not a, I mean, it can't be a sacramental confession if you're not sacramentally Catholic and baptized, but I can tell you from my interviews, and you know too from your work, people want to confess their sins and they want to believe that they can be blessed. So some kind of a space that's in a public area where people have a beautiful statue of Mary, there might be some music playing, and there's an opportunity to talk to someone. That's a thought. You know, I also initially thought about music too, Paul, but I haven't figured that out yet, but I will tell you from teaching my students that, and from working with so many different kinds of students, that music also speaks directly to people's hearts. So art, music, and finally also just narratives, good stories. I'm not here at Divine Mercy to advocate we all become, you know, TikTok influencers. But a lot of people are being influenced by TikTok. Video, image, story, quick, right? So maybe that's not exactly it, but like those elements. The question then becomes how to make the connection between that and the full participation in the sacramental. So where I was going with the Catholic anthropology and cultural anthropology is, yes, I think we should have Eucharistic processions and outdoor festivals and things like what I described Orsi was talking about. And people will see it. And if those were happening in these towns, what's ended up happening, as we all know, right, the suburbanization of churches, the emptying out of the cities, and people tend to drive to go to church, and the ritual is enclosed in some ways in upon itself, right? So the churches Orsi was talking about, you know, had an outward looking glance. So did the ones that Peter Brown is writing about. And it's almost like we've forgotten that, because we've internalized this privatization of religion, that what a ritual is what happens inside of those walls, and don't let that spill out. But then where is somebody like Jason or somebody else going to actually just see, and like, what are these people doing? Well, let me tell you, the Haitians in Miami have no problem with that. They just block the streets out and they just go. They go in mass. Pilgrimage sites. I mean, again, we know Jason may not go to a mass, but, you know, do you think Jason would like to go to the replica of Our Lady of Lourdes up in Emmitsburg? I mean, maybe he would if somebody took him. It's a pretty nice place. When I go there, I mostly see immigrants. It's telling you something, isn't it? Oh, they come in the van. They come in vans and buses. They come with their candles and their petitions. That's the closest I've gotten to seeing something like what Orsi is describing. Not the trumpets and the bands and the sausages and the nuts. But maybe. Other questions from the audience here, present. Did you agree with me? Yes.
If you could just comment on what you feel like the value add is, particularly for a Christian perspective versus ritual found in other religions.
Okay, so what's the value added of Christian ritual versus rituals found in other religions? Great question. I think what I find so appealing about the Christian faith is that there is an understanding of what is the object of the devotion of the ritual that is distinct from paganism and from Judaism. And anybody who claims that it's not distinct, they don't know what a distinction is, or they think the distinctions don't matter. I've heard people say that there is no distinction, that all religions are ultimately all doing the same thing. So the problem with saying that is that the practitioners of the religion don't say that, right? So again, it's putting an academic framework on, well, there is no answer to what's the object of the ritual, so therefore all rituals are human creations doing the same thing. That gets rid of revelation, and it gets rid of an understanding of the interaction with the divine. So I have a friend who's, of a Hindu background, and her grandmother makes offerings of flowers and has an altar at home and, brings petitions. But Hindus aren't monotheists, and they don't believe in the redemption of a personal soul. I think, and I wrote about this a little bit with Faith Makes Us Live, because Haitians, many, not all, but some practice voodoo, which obviously very ritualized, very embodied. It's music, it's, visual, it's all of that. But I read a lot of the voodoo scholars, because people said to me, how do you know that these Catholic rituals aren't really just voodoo rituals? So, which is when I turned to Al Rabateau's work, and I read a lot of other work. Well, in the end of the day, I have yet to find another religion that has a ritual that claims to be a participation in the suffering and redemption, the suffering on the cross and the redemption of the divine. So even scholars of Haitian voodoo will say there's a lot of analogous concepts between voodoo and Christianity. So people say it's all syncretistic. Oh, but there's a boundary. And the boundaries around God became a human being and took on our sins on the cross, and then resurrected from the dead. No other religion claims that. So I think that the Christian liturgy needs to always have, and this is what I think kind of the understanding of a Christian theological liturgy needs to have present always: the mysteries of the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Now, in some places we've lost that, either because the liturgy itself doesn't do that anymore, or because people aren't thinking about that. Right? But that's ultimately what a Christian liturgy is about, has those mysteries of the faith there. But I think my point was that scholarship about human societies has shown us that we are fundamentally beings of rituals. And so ritual can be a way to open up a conversation with people, but it doesn't answer the question about what's the meaning. And is there an actual presence of divine? And if so, what is that divine? For that, we need revelation to answer that question, and we need tradition, which gets to someone else's question. Are there rituals, perhaps secular, you would recommend avoiding, as they may unknowingly undercut or subvert resilience? That is a great question. Maybe this is not what you're looking for, a person in the audience virtually who asked this question. I used that story about Renee cutting herself because, oddly enough, well, first of all, a lot of people cut themselves, so I would avoid that one. But she did it to numb her pain. She did it because she felt when she was cutting herself, she didn't feel her psychological pain. And she did it in a ritualistic fashion. Students have told me that they find experiences of inflicting pain upon themselves or other people a ritualistic way to build community, because you tear people down. And when you tear people down and make them vulnerable in front of you, i.e. hazing rituals, you bond as a community. I don't think hazing rituals are a good way to build community. And when students are engaging in ritualistic behaviors of drinking or cutting or physical degradation in order to build community, I think we need to draw the line. And I'm telling you, this happens amongst people on college campuses and other places more than we'd like to admit, which is why I go back to, how about nature? And how about museums? And how about other kinds of making music together, right? What are some other healthier ways that young people can have these kind of ecstatic experiences where they're not intentionally inflicting pain on people? Sports competitions, great, not ritualistic cutting or ritualistic forms of drinking or ritualistically introducing people to drugs in a communal setting for the purpose of somehow broadening our sense of what reality has. This stuff can end in, this stuff comes crashing down, is what I'm trying to say. But people do it and they submit to it, is what I'm also trying to say. People submit to doing it because guess what? They want the good of community. And they're willing to submit to degrading rituals in order to belong to something. And if we're not offering them other kinds of rituals, guess what? I think they're going to keep doing it.
I think we have time for one last question. Did you have a second question, Dr. Liz?
Yes, but I think I'd have one, and that's enough.
Well, the last thing I'll say that is a answer to like a number of these questions here, which I think I've already touched on in most ways, is that we need more spaces like Divine Mercy, where people of goodwill want to be trained in a particular discipline, in this case, psychology, and want to take all the good from that field and bring it back into dialogue with the 2,000-year tradition of the human person that's philosophical, that's cultural, that's theological, but it's also deeply human. And so the work that you're doing here at Divine Mercy, training people in psychology, training people to encounter people of all backgrounds, in all walks of life, whatever their age, sex, race, whatever is afflicting them, I really firmly believe that the kind of formation that you're offering is going to create people who have that abundance of love that I saw and I felt in Renee. And you put those people out into the world and you don't know what you're doing. But I do believe in spontaneous order and the superabundance of love. And in your vocations here in psychology and all of those listening tonight, that if you seek knowledge and seek to grow in love, despite what's going on in the world, despite what's going on in your own life, you can enhance and share that abundance of love. Thank you.